I spoke with Ross McGraw on the podcast. He's the president for Core, this heat sensor monitor that we're seeing a lot of the World Tour riders using. Mm-hmm. And his contention is that we've gone quite deep down the rabbit hole, especially at World Tour on aerodynamics, that the gains left to be made are very hard-won gains that are going to be very expensive. He feels the next generation is going to be in fabrics that are heat tested, so to keep core body temperature down. And the idea of heat is kind of a two sides to a coin, because your core temperature goes up in a race, that's impacting performance. But you can also use heat quite strategically, like we see in Remco in a recent vlog, using heat to simulate the effects of altitude training. Is this something you've played around with?
Absolutely. Especially for Unbound. Heat training is incredibly important because Unbound is usually a hot race and it's a very long race. And the longer you spend in the heat, the effects compound, the negative effects of the heat compound, and your power output takes a massive dive if you've been riding for hours in the heat. I think people underestimate how much heat negatively affects their performance. It's massive. And I think part of the reason why Unbound in 2022 was such a fast year, despite the horrendous conditions, it was raining that year for pretty much the whole race. It was raining. So you would think, okay, rain, that's got to be slow. Like we're riding through mud. That's got to be a slow year. It was up until that point, it was the fastest Unbound that we'd ever seen. And I think it's just because riders could stay cool the entire time. It was raining and it was cool and power outputs were high. And you see the same thing at for example, Leadville last year was a cool year and we saw record breaking times as well. The high temperatures in a long race make a huge impact. And that's actually something that I took into account this year. And I did heat training, but also I actually took it into account in my race strategy, and I carried a lot more fluid with me than basically most of my competitors. For example, at the last aid station, I saw most of my competitors were taking two big liter bottles with them because it was only 50 miles to the finish. I took a 3-liter bladder. I had a bottle down the front of my jersey, and then I had 4 bottles on my bike. And only the bladder was for drinking, and all of those other bottles were for pouring on myself and trying to keep my body temperature cool. And I actually think that it made a huge difference.
When you say you're using heat training, were you using it for acclimation purposes to get ready for Unbound, or were you using heat training to elicit a physiological response, like similar to going to altitude?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's both. I would say it's both for sure. Yeah. My heat training this year was... Usually what I do is I go to Texas before Unbound because it's extremely hot in Texas and you can ride every single day in 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's great heat training. It got a little bit messed up this year because I had some health issues. I had an abscess in my throat that needed... It's a long story, but basically I
went... the Instagram picture, it was brutal.
Yeah. I went back home and to North Carolina, and my heat training wasn't as good this year. Like I just didn't ride in as hot of temperatures as I normally do. And maybe that made me more scared of the heat than I otherwise would have been. And that's kind of why I brought all this extra fluid with me. I try to ride during the hottest part of the day. I have done saunas in the past. But yeah, I mean, there's a physiological effect for sure. And it is similar to altitude, I think, mostly in raising blood volume.
Obviously, training intensity and duration, they're highly specific to the athlete, the phase of the season they're in, their ability to, absorb, to use a French word, absorb the training load. But I chatted to Matt Beers 2 weeks before Unbound, and the volume that him and Keegan were getting through was insane. Like I've had, so many of the World Tour riders on the podcast, Mohoric, Fred Roy, all these guys, and they're not getting through anywhere close to the same amount of volume or intensity in a week as Matt Beers was. And I was almost thinking, it's like, has he gone into this overcooked? Has he done way too much? How did you approach volume going into the race?
Yeah, no, this is something that I talked about in in the first video I did this year, which was talking about my plan to train for the upcoming season, I was talking about how lifetime Grand Prix athletes, specifically around Unbound, are doing training weeks that even World Tour road racers don't do.
Nowhere close.
Yeah.
Like Jay Vine was doing like 13, 14 hours a week last time I spoke to him. Matt Beers was doing 38 hours weeks.
Yeah. It's crazy. And that's become, I don't want to say it's become common, but there are a fair number of lifetime Grand Prix athletes that a 38-hour week is not, that's just what you do when you're training for Unbound. I did a lot of volume leading into Unbound too. I did a 2-week Unbound block. And last year when I did my Unbound block, I did a 30-hour week followed by a 35-hour week. And I thought I was in amazing shape for Unbound. So my plan this year was to double down on that and go bigger. And I believe I did a 35-hour week followed by a 40-hour week this year. So,
like, speaking with, Dan Lorang, Primoz Roglic's coach on the podcast, a lot of people still subscribe to the idea that you're better off being 10% undercooked than 1% overcooked. So how do you find that ideal balance? Like, you could do a 35-hour week and easily be overcooked. So how are you judging where the balance is on that?
Yeah, so I will say that my plan was to end this 2-week block 3 weeks out from the race. So 3 weeks is a long taper. That's a very long taper. It's longer than I'm a coach as well. 3 weeks is longer than I ever recommend somebody taper for an event. But I did know that the volume was going to be crazy high. And I actually think that getting sick with this throat abscess may have helped me. And I'll explain why. I got that the week following the end of this 75-hour block. And that week, I only rode my bike for 4 hours. And there was a 3-day period where I didn't ride my bike at all. So essentially, I went from a very high training load, higher than it's ever been, to extremely low training load. If I'm training regularly, a 4-hour week is I might as well have not ridden my bike. It's basically complete rest, right? So maybe I'll try to purposely work this into my training in the future. But I think having that super high training load followed by incredibly low training load may have actually helped me for race day.
Any thought that maybe the throat abscess is related to the huge overload? We've all had that experience of doing a 8-day stage race and you're sick the day after.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, my immune system was probably compromised, and it could certainly be the case that if I hadn't done that insane block, I would have not gotten it. But again, if that high training load followed by that low training load was what got me in shape to get a top 10 at Unbound, then I don't know, maybe it was worth it.
Yeah, it's definitely worth deconstructing that and having a look. I know you're a big fan of strength training as well, and you have some great videos on your channel about strength training. Is that something you incorporate all season round, or do you step away from the gym when you get into this serious middle of the Grand Prix year?
Mm-hmm. I personally step away from the gym in season, and it's mainly because, and depending on which athlete I'm coaching, that advice can change. For example, a Masters athlete, I would probably suggest that a Masters athlete stay in the gym all year, because the older you get, the quicker you're losing muscle mass, and the more important it becomes to maintain that muscle mass as much as you can. But at my age and with my racing calendar the way it is, it gets quite hard to recover from these events. Unbound, I feel like it takes almost 2 weeks to recover from as it is. And when you've got events back to back, and they're these long events that take 7 to 10 hours, it gets quite hard to maintain the gym work in season. So I do end up letting that go, and that's usually the first thing to go. And that's not to say that there couldn't be some benefit from maintaining gym work year round. I am open to that, and there are a lot of people that are huge. I'm a huge fan of the gym, but there are a lot of people who are huge fans of the gym that when I say I take a step back from gym training in season, they give me pushback and they're like, why do you do that? You could be so much faster if you were doing squats in July. And maybe they're right. I'm open to them being right, but at least from a practical standpoint, it gets to be too much at a certain point.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please click up here. There's another video I know that you're absolutely going to love. Click over here and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our amazing upcoming guests.